Today on Vatican Connections, Anglicans and Catholics celebrate 50 years of dialogue in Rome. We discuss family, Synods, and Amoris Laetitia, and review the Pope's trip to Georgia and Azerbaijan. Hello and welcome, I'm Emily Callan. 38 Anglican and Catholic bishops from around the world were sent out to pray and proclaim the gospel and accomplish acts of mercy together. Pope Francis and Archbishop Justin Welby of Canterbury commissioned the bishops in Rome on Wednesday at the end of a prayer service. It concluded a 2-day visit to the Eternal City by both delegations, marking 50 years of renewed dialogue between the Anglican and Catholic Church. That dialogue opened up thanks to Pope Paul VI and Anglican Archbishop Michael Ramsey in 1966, a relationship which continued to flourish under each of their successors so far, and now under Pope Francis and Archbishop Welby. The Vespers took place in St. Gregory on the Kilian Hill Church, a symbolic location. Most popes and the heads of the Anglican Church have met there since the historic first meeting 50 years ago. It was also the place of another great commissioning, that of St. Augustine of Canterbury, who was sent to evangelize England in the 6th century by St. Gregory. The Holy Father and the head of the Church of England both presided the Vespers and had the chance to speak during the prayer service. In his homily, the Pope said, "When, as disciples of Jesus, we offer our service in a joint way, one alongside the other, when we promote openness and encounter, vanquishing the temptation of closures and isolation, we work at the same time for both the unity of Christians and that of the human family." He also asked, why can't we do this with our Anglican brothers and sisters? Can we witness to Jesus working together with our Catholic brothers and sisters? The Archbishop of Canterbury responded with a powerful image. When we fight among ourselves as Christians, he says, when we lose the obligation of sharing mercy and forgiveness, we not only disobey the explicit prayer and command of our Lord, but we also become shepherds who devour the sheep. The Church becomes a circus for gladiatorial combat in which the losers are shown no mercy. The prayer service concluded with an exchange of gifts and the signing of a joint declaration. The document mentions the progress that has been made concerning many areas that have kept them apart, although new disagreements are present, which are serious obstacles to their full unity. However, they are undeterred, recognizing their trust in the Holy Spirit to deepen understanding. A conference on sports and faith opened at the Vatican last Wednesday. Sport at the service of humanity was the theme of this first world meeting organized by the Pontifical Council for Culture. Pope Francis addressed the participants in Pope Paul VI Hall for the opening ceremony, and he was joined by Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, and the President of the International Olympic Committee, Thomas Bach, both sponsors of the event. In sport, as in life, competing for the result is important, but playing well and fairly is even more important, the Pope said during the opening ceremonies, which opened with a choreography incorporating athletes, dancers, acrobats, and music. Commenting on the Olympic and Paralympic Games in Rio, he said the whole world watched. And when we see these athletes give it their all, we almost feel proud. There is great beauty in the harmony of certain movements and in the power of teamwork, he added. He reminded participants that sport is not only for highly trained athletes, it can be enjoyed by everyone, and stressed that sport should be accessible to all, especially to people with disabilities. He thanks sporting institutions who courageously take to heart the value of inclusion. The Pope remembered children and all those living on the margins of society, where sport can give them a greater sense of their human dignity. He ended his speech by thanking once again all the institutions, sporting societies, movements, sponsors, and businesses who strive to create a society that is fair and transparent. He challenged everyone present to maintain, he said, the honesty of sport, of protecting it from manipulations and commercial abuse.
Last Tuesday, feast day of St. Francis and patron saint of Italy, the Pope made a surprise visit to the areas affected by an earthquake last August. The Holy Father arrived in Amatrice before going to Arquata, Cumuli and Pescara del Tronto, explaining his visit with these words. I thought long and hard in the first days of these many pains that my visit perhaps would be more a hindrance than a help, he said. I didn't want to be a bother, so I let a little time pass so that some things could be resolved, like the school. But from the first moment, I felt that I needed to come to you, simply to express my closeness to you, nothing more, he continued. Solidarity and prayer, this is my offering to you. May the Lord bless you all. May Our Lady watch over you in this moment of sadness, pain and trial. The Pope arrived in the morning in Amatrice, accompanied by the Bishop of Rieti, Monsignor Domenico Pompili. He met school children, students of the elementary and secondary school. Pope Francis embraced and greeted them one by one. Then he spent half an hour listening to the story of the young people. He let us stop, alone in silence, in front of the rubble to pray. In the afternoon, the Pontiff was in San Pellegrino di Norcia and entered the red zone along with the local bishop. Shortly before the arrival of the Pope, a quake of 3.6 magnitude epicenter was close to Norcia, was clearly felt by its residents. Let's move forward. There is always a future was another phrase the Holy Father repeated several times during the day, always renewing the invitation to the people to pray for him. Everyone was surprised by the sudden trip, including the mayors of each town. In fact, the Pope didn't have the usual security which surrounds his planned visits. The decision was made only Tuesday morning around 7 a.m. Pope Benedict XVI made a similar trip in April 2009 to Onna in Abruzzo, which was struck by an earthquake along with other small villages, and he wanted to bring comfort to the people of the city. And now, 7 years later, it was Pope Francis who went to deliver a message of the Church's closeness to those affected last month and who are working hard to get back to normal.
The Vatican announced a new synod to take place in October 2018, established by Pope Francis on the theme of youth, faith, and vocational discernment. In its press release, the Vatican stated that the theme is consistent with the results of the recent synod assemblies on the family and with the content of the post-synodal exhortation Amoris Laetitia. The communiqué addressed the goal of the next assembly of bishops to know how to better accompany young people in discerning vocation, to help them mature in their faith, to open them up to an encounter with God so they can participate in building up the church and society. This week marked 1 year since the opening of the last synod on the family. A synod which gave us a document still wildly talked about today, Amoris Laetitia. Since its release last April, this nearly 300-page exhortation is still being unpacked. Earlier today, I had the chance to speak to Sebastian Gomes, producer at Salt and Light TV. He was present at both synods of bishops and helps us clarify current issues surrounding the Pope's post-synodal exhortation. Sebastian, thanks a lot for being with me today on Vatican Connections.
No problem. Good to be with you.
Now, you've been to both synods on the family. Looking back, what was that experience like for you?
Yeah, I had a very unique opportunity, obviously, to see the whole development of the synod structure under Pope Francis up close. The synods on the family are really, Pope Francis's first step in trying to get us back to being a synodal church, which for a huge chunk of the Catholic Church's history, the last 2,000 years, it has been. It kind of trailed off as we got into the modern period. But the experience itself was, unforgettable in many ways, especially because I had been to the synod in 2012 and saw what it was like before as opposed to what it was like with Pope Francis. And, he really set the tone for the whole thing. That was clear. The bishops came in from all around the world, and they were trying to grapple with what he was calling them to do. And what he said was, we have to be able to listen humbly and we have to be able to speak with a certain degree of openness and boldness. So there was a real maturation process that took place. He wanted this to be on the minds of the bishops and of the whole church for 2+ years, period, so that we could really get into the issues, and so we could learn, as I said, to speak with boldness, but also to listen humbly, especially when there's disagreement.
Now, out of that synod came, or those 2 synods came Amoris Laetitia, which is the topic of a lot of conversation still today.
Yes, and will be, I think, for a long time.
And will be, exactly, because we're still unpacking everything that the Pope wrote in that post-synodal exhortation. Now, what have you noticed with what's come out of that, or how people are relating to Amoris Laetitia since it came out last April?
Right. The document itself, it's amazing. It has so much of what the synods, like the bishops who were gathered in synod, said over the course of the 2 years. A lot of people don't pick up on that, but it's really picking up on so much of what they said, reiterating what they said, and adding his own, 2 cents, his own, kind of original ideas. What's really interesting about the document is kind of how it's broken up. So there's a lot here. There's a lot covered, and some of it is very beautiful and pastoral, like chapter 4. Which is a whole reflection on love in the family and how men and women relate in a relationship, a marital relationship, and what the family should be kind of based on. So it ranges from that, and then you have what has become the most controversial area, which is chapter 8, on how to deal with some of the real difficult, complex pastoral challenges.
Right. Now, you mentioned chapter 4. And that was something that came up just recently last weekend when he came back from his trip to Georgia and Azerbaijan. And so on his flight back, when he always does his press conferences. Now he was asked about Amoris Laetitia, or about the topic of the family, because it was very much discussed over the weekend in his speeches. Now he did say that chapter 4 was the core of Amoris Laetitia, and that we can't just read the document in little parts. It has to be read as a whole from beginning to end. How does that shed light on maybe the rest of the document?
Right, yeah. I think he wanted to take some of the focus away from chapter 8, because I think in the media especially, we pick up on what's controversial, and that's everybody's talking about chapter 8, because I mentioned the difficult pastoral issues like the sacraments for divorced and remarried people, which was a big topic at the Synod. But I think he wanted to take a little bit more focus off of that and put it on what he said, as you rightly pointed out, the core of the document, which is a real reflection on what love looks like in a family context, and how that needs to be developed and sustained, and how people need to sacrifice for each other. And what's really remarkable about chapter 4 is there's so many people who I've heard, have read it and have said, gosh, he gets it. Like he knows what family life is like. And, when you have people who have been married for 30, 40, 50 years, picking this up and saying, yeah, this is exactly right. There's something really, Francis has his finger on the pulse of what the reality is. And he articulates what love can be in a really remarkable way that makes sense to people. And so I think he wanted to just put the focus on something positive, something good, which is love.
Right. So moving forward, how are you seeing this document, Amoris Laetitia, being implemented?
Yeah, well, it's going to take some time, obviously, because these things just kind of drop into the church, and then we have to all struggle to deal with it. But a huge responsibility is with the bishops. They need to take it. They need to adapt it, in a sense, to their local church, to their local reality. And we're already starting to see, as you mentioned, different bishops from different regions, different areas, different provinces in Canada have issued pastoral guidelines on the document and how they plan to implement it in the local church. One of the issues is that what happens if you have different interpretations of it. So this is a real big question mark in the church, and I think Francis has obviously given his point of view, his 2 cents, if you will, about the direction we should be going. But that doesn't mean that every bishop is going to follow suit, and get in line in exactly the same way. And I think Francis would even be okay with that. But there's a few core things that all the bishops want to, keep front and center, and that is emphasizing, first of all, the mercy of God, that mercy has to be the primary kind of way we deal with people, the way we treat these issues. And part of that, too, is about inclusion and integration, how do we make the church a little bit more open, welcoming, inclusive for people?
Right.
How do we make people feel that this is something they can be a part of, even and despite of some of the challenges and the problems that they face, that the church is here for them. So I think the bishops have to keep those things kind of front and center and build any of their pastoral guidelines around that. But certainly there's going to be much, much more conversation about Amoris Laetitia in the years to come.
Before we finish, it's just you have the book in front of you.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to ask you if maybe there was something in there that really struck you.
Well, yeah, very interesting, actually. One of the things that has flown under the radar in this document is a whole new development of conscience and what it means to have a formed and informed conscience. Now, this is not a new idea in the Catholic Church. It's an old idea, but it's something that I think Francis wants us to get back to, and it's part of everything that we've been talking about. I mean, if we're talking about a very difficult situation, family situation that people are dealing with, if we're looking at the potential of, people receiving the sacraments in a state that typically we wouldn't, suggest that they participate in them or even close the door to them, the development of your own conscience is hugely, hugely significant. And Francis says in here very clearly, we, as pastors, as shepherds, as priests in the church, are called to form consciences, not to replace them. And that says a heck of a lot about what he sees about that and the value he sees in conscience, which is obviously a gift of free will from God, and something that every Catholic, every Christian has to really, really think about and try to form in a dynamic way in dealing with some of the complex situations that life throws at you.
At last year's Synod on the Family, the question of conscience was raised by Canadian Bishop Noel Simard of Valleyfield during a period of free intervention. Sebastian interviewed Bishop Simard, and he shared with us the appeal he made to the Synod Fathers on that matter.
I just called the Fathers of the Synod, not to forget the moral conscience of the people. Yes, we have the doctrine, we have, the mercy of God. But in between, we need to remember that people must obey their conscience. And we have to respect, the freedom of conscience. Yes, we have to form a conscience. But forming a conscience is, first of all, making the condition for people to hear the voice of God. And it is so important today. There is so much noise in the world today that if we can bring people to stop and to listen to their conscience, to the voice of God. We call the conscience the sanctuary of God in a person's heart. So we need, to trust in the people, and for sure we have to accompany them, because we cannot leave the people and decide what they want. We have to form and present them, the teaching of the church, the possibilities, but at the end we have to trust in them and leave them to their own conscience, an informed conscience.
Last Sunday, the Pope completed his 3-day visit to the Caucasus, a trip that took him to 2 countries where Catholics are a minority. In fact, the majority of Christians in Georgia are Orthodox, while in Azerbaijan, Muslims make up most of the population. But this voyage was particularly important, first because it complemented, as he said, his visit to Armenia last June, and second, it focused on interfaith dialogue and religious liberty. Here's a recap of his trip. For his 16th voyage outside of Italy, the Pope brought with him a message of peace and reconciliation to both countries. Upon arriving in Georgia, he met with the president and civil authorities, where the president spoke of the importance of respecting the independence of each country. The Pope then expressed, once again, a word he would use several times over the weekend: how dialogue is the key to counter violence, persecution, and build peace. He was then received by the Patriarch of Georgia, Catholicos Ilya II, and presented himself as a pilgrim in these lands. He evoked the brothers Peter and Andre, who were both called by Jesus for one mission. That mission is shared by Orthodox and Catholics. Though the relationship is not an easy one, he appealed to the Orthodox community to reject anything that impedes the proclamation of the gospel. The Holy Father ended his first day in the Caucasus with the Assyro-Chaldean community in a prayer service for peace. It was led by Patriarch Louis Sacco of Baghdad. The Pope did not give a speech. He only said a prayer for the intentions of Syria, Iraq, and all the areas affected in the Middle East by persecution, war, and devastation. In the morning on Saturday, he made his way to a stadium in Tbilisi to celebrate Mass. Mainly Catholics were present. And in his homily, he said that God is like a mother who embraces us and consoles us. Many of them feel they are unjustly discriminated against in the country because of their baptism and the fact that they are a minority. So he told them to keep the door open to consolation through prayer, confession, and the Eucharist. He made a similar plea when meeting with religious, where he talked about ecumenism, and he warned against the sin of proselytizing. Finally, he completed his day in Georgia in the Patriarchal Cathedral of Mesquita, where he met once again the Patriarch of Georgia and members of the Orthodox community. There, he expressed his sadness over divisions that exist between Christians, which are like deep lacerations that wound the Lord's flesh. After arriving in Azerbaijan the next day, Pope Francis celebrated Mass in Baku with the small Catholic community and presented them with two elements which are essential, according to the Pope, to the Christian life, which are faith and service. After meeting with civil authorities, he ended his trip in the Caucasus with an interreligious encounter at the Haydar Aliyev Mosque in Baku. The Grand Mufti thanked the Pope for his strong criticism of problems that concern the world, namely the crisis of migration and connecting Islam to terrorism. Pope Francis responded by saying that dialogue and prayer are the roads to everlasting peace. Dialogue doesn't mean syncretism, he said, but a respectful alliance, and pointed to the country's constitution on religious liberty, which must be guaranteed. Every month, the Holy Father releases his prayer intentions in the Pope video, a global initiative launched by the Pope World Prayer Network and their Apostleship of Prayer in the United States. The Pope's evangelization intention is that World Mission Sunday may renew within all Christian communities the joy of the gospel and the responsibility to announce it. And his universal intention for October is for journalists.
Suelo preguntarme cómo se pueden poner los medios de comunicación al servicio de una cultura del encuentro. Necesitamos información que conduzca al compromiso por el bien del género humano y el planeta. Súmate conmigo en esta petición, para que los periodistas en el ejercicio de su profesión estén siempre motivados por el respeto a la verdad y un fuerte sentido ético. ¿Me ayudas a difundir esta intención?
Sí. Sí.
Yes.
Oui. Sí.
Sí.
Ayo.
Sí.
Sí.
Sí. Sí.
God is not known through grand ideas and extensive study, but rather through the littleness of a humble and trusting heart. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to send them via Vatican Connections Twitter page at Vatican Connections. I'll be happy to answer them on our next episode. That's all for tonight. Thanks for watching and see you next week.